Here we go. Yeah, great. Okay, we are live. Well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And Barbara and I are both really excited to have our guest today, Eliot Pattison, here with us. He's a big favorite of everybody here at the store. We've been following his work closely for many years.
From this book, let me just hold it up, my own personal copy of Skull Mantra, an
Right.
Edgar winner for Best Debut Novel and the start of a series that is set in mostly Tibet, maybe sort of harks back to China, and features Police Inspector Shan Tao Yun. But there are also some interesting Native American elements in here, Navajo, that creep into this. So
Yep.
it's a wonderful series. And I don't think you've written one for quite a while, have you, Eliot?
Well, we decided that after 10, it was probably time to put that to bed. I would be open to doing another one, but I haven't really pursued it very aggressively. It's a great, we still get a great response on that series. A lot of active interest. I've had several interviews as a result of this book launch, and I think most of them, maybe all of them, have spent time talking about that series as well.
You just can't. I mean, I still remember going to Book Expo when they still had Book Expo, and your book was featured, and I picked up the advanced reading copy, not this beautiful finished book, which Eliot signed for us, but a paper copy that's put out in front of publication. And I just fell in love with it, and I sent you quite a few, if I remember, to sign. And then it won the Edgar, and I thought, yes, I love that. For those of you who don't know, the Edgar is an award from the Mystery Writers of America, named after Edgar Allan Poe. And the Edgar for Best First Novel has launched many a terrific career. Right, Patrick?
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Right. So carry on with your spiel, which I interrupted, but it was perfect.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, everybody's heard my spiel. If you have questions for Eliot, go ahead and put them in the comments field, and I'll be happy to ask any of them. And also, I'll put a buy link. We should be getting signed copies of the new book, Freedom's Ghost, in very shortly. And I must say, it's fascinating, Eliot, that you've written a book set in the colonial period, which is so fascinating and so underexplored, really, in crime fiction. Wouldn't you agree, Barbara?
I think so. Actually, there's a great essay on Eliot's website, which I can pull up on my phone, about why he is writing this series. And I could read it, but you know what? You could just tell us, Eliot, why is it that you have decided to write a series?
I also just did a post for Writer's Digest on historical fiction, historical novels, and it was sort of the title, I think, was like the challenging duty of the historical novelist, getting using the facts to get to the truth. And I think that kind of says a lot there, because I think that our history books have let us down, especially around the founding of America. It's just an amazing time, one of the most amazing times of all history, I believe. And I think that historical novels are a really, really good way to get people to connect, with our past, much better than most history books these days. And so, I feel, a responsibility there, but I also have a great passion for this period, which I've been following all of my life. When I was very young, my parents were both from outside of Philadelphia. We would go into Independence Hall probably once a year. And back then, Liberty Bell was not guarded. And I remember I would go up and I would hug it. And I would feel like the warmth of the metal, and it sort of like resonated with me, really, and that was very moving as well. And then we would also go to Valley Forge, so it all kind of fell together. And then I was I grew up on a farm. We off finding arrowheads, and so history was really, really very much a passion of mine from a very early age.
So this wonderful book is our November historical fiction book of the month, which is why Eliot is signing copies that are coming to us. And, it's the great American experiment, which it really is. We talked about that with Andrew Cleveland last night, is wobbling at the moment. And certainly dangerous forces afoot And I like what Eliot has to say here. We are taught to think of the revolution, American Revolution, in terms of a compressed military timeline, when in fact the real revolution was a gradual process of transformation over decades, as scores of thousands of very diverse colonists reinvented themselves as American. My novels bear witness to the pain and exhilaration of this process. If you've ever been to Williamsburg, for example, that's one place that you see a movement from being colonists and being governed from Britain. If you go to Boston and Marblehead, where this book is set, called Freedom's Coast. Eliot, can you hold up a copy since, our copies are with you currently? There it is, right? When I wrote about it, I said it's a rousing adventure set in Marblehead and Boston and reminds us why we fought for a break of monarchy and how messy rebellion and government can be. It's the latest on a journey through the revolution that is compared to Patrick O'Brian's Master and Commander novels, which, I think are marvelous. And he was able to, what did he write, Eliot? 2020, wasn't it? 21?
More than 20. 21, 22, something like that. Yeah,
I think so. And also, it's an important story in a month when we celebrate Thanksgiving. And, part of our, even if we're celebrating Thanksgiving from a particular perspective, which is being challenged by all kinds of Indigenous authors and voices right now. But it's still important to remember how the world was in so much transition. And you point that out, Eliot, that the Scottish Highlands culture had been destroyed after Culloden in 1745, that the woodland nations in America were constantly being assailed, especially the eastern ones like the Seneca, the Iroquois, and so forth. The British had just defeated France in Quebec, where I just was, actually, on the Plains of Abraham. I always go and visit. When was that? 1760 something?
Quebec was 1760, I think, yeah.
Right. Anyway, the British finally took over from the French, although Quebec has remained defiantly French until this day. So there were all these forces in work where old orders were being overturned, and colonists were growing in economic power, growing in, their desire to have a voice in their own government. So why don't you tell us about your hero and what happens?
Well, so this theme that you've emphasized, thank you for that, of Americans finding their identity and breaking away from the British it runs throughout this entire series. And this is the 7th book in the series. The series being called the Bone Rattler series, the first name of the first book. And it highlights as many themes as in all my books, and several subplots that tie together, of course, at the end. But my protagonist is a Scottish Highlander who had been studying to be a doctor in Edinburgh, the premier medical school in the world, and had been arrested suddenly because he was found to have been giving some aid to a very elderly great uncle who had been a sort of a last surviving rebel, a Jacobite rebel. This was long after the war, and Duncan was abruptly imprisoned and then transported for indentured servitude to America, which happened to thousands of Scots after the last Jacobite uprising. And so he was sort of at the tail end of that movement. But here he is thinking he was going to be a doctor in Scotland, and suddenly he's on a ship, basically a prisoner going to the New World, and doesn't know what's going to happen. He winds up being indentured to an aristocratic family, but then sent abruptly to their estate on the wilderness on the frontier, and then his adventures start. He begins to encounter murders, and his medical background helps him understand the murders and bring justice. And he earns the name, the nickname, sort of the tribal nickname of Death Speaker, because he's able to speak for the dead and find them reconciliation. And it's much more for the tribes, not really so much about what we would call justice as about reconciliation, getting peace. And of course, that almost always means finding what we would call justice, or at least identifying the killers, etc. And then he has, all of my characters, all the lead characters, have great contradictions built into them and great conflicts that they face. He is by now he's engaged to Sarah Ramsey, who's the daughter of this powerful aristocrat who owns the estate that they live on, and Sarah is this very resourceful, beautiful, engaging, very smart daughter of this iconic aristocrat in England, with the unusual twist that she was raised by the Mohawk tribe after being captured as a young girl and sort of disowned by her father, and then she was released as a result of the treaties that were reached after the French and Indian War. And this is based on a lot of true stories. There are a lot of people who were captured and released after that by treaty, and they didn't actually. Most of them actually didn't want to go back. They wanted to stay with the tribes. That's a separate, separate set of stories there. And then there's Conewago, the third main character. Conewago is a very old native from the Nipmuc tribe, a Massachusetts tribe that is pretty much gone. He was identified by the Jesuits back in late in the last century, meaning the late 1600s, as what we would call a high potential student, and was taken from his tribe to go to Europe and have an education by the Jesuits, and then 10-12 years later he comes back, and his tribe and his family have completely disappeared. And so he's got this tragic background. He keeps trying to find his people for decades, and he can't find them. And he and Duncan settled into sort of a relationship that's sort of an ad hoc father-son type relationship. And you might say, in terms of from the mystery crime perspective, he's Duncan's Dr. Watson. So this wise old native, counseling Duncan about finding the truth, and he sort of acts as Duncan's conscience a lot of times.
Actually, there's a parallel, not only Holmes and Watson, but William Kent Kruger, who writes a wonderful award-winning series. He has a Métis character called Henry Malou, who is now 100 years old or something. But Henry's never going to die. He's going to just go on. But Henry is an advisor and a counselor. This is in Upper Minnesota, to the main character in Kent's series. And I love the way that he too, he's not really a Watson. He's much more an advisor than a co-investigator.
So it's just that he comes up with observations sometimes that help Duncan solve the mysteries, from his very different perspective. And
right.
And the tribes do figure pretty heavily in the series, not so much in this installment, but in some of the prior books. His main challenge, the main plots are about solving murders within the native tribes and the Iroquois primarily.
So we're in 1770 here, but as you point out, that the 18th century was a century of enormous transition. So 1700 was remarkably different from 1800 by the time we got through it. Other authors have written about some of the financial institutions and misadventures that happened during the time. Commerce was changing, travel was changing. There was so much going on. And it's almost impossible to keep stability in a time like that. I think we're going through something very similar in the digital age, that many things are breaking down, and it's leading to a lot of upset, a lot of disorder. The consequences, God only knows what AI is going to wind up doing. But it's normal that there are periods of stability that are then, racked by enormous change, economic, social, whatever. And while you're living through it, it's really difficult. So
these are, you can say my books are about the people living through that. It really, the characters almost all might be characterized as sort of outcasts, exiles, refugees. But really everybody in the colonies is in an identity crisis, and I talk a lot about that in my commentary about the books and my posts and all. And they were all sort of on their own paths of self-discovery that begin to converge. Okay, Paul Revere saying the British are coming. 30, 40 years before that, people would have said the British are coming. They would have said like the soldiers are coming. They didn't have like this arm's length perspective of the British. They were sort of British themselves. And, but by 1770, that was really becoming instilled, especially in Boston. Boston was, had been such a center of culture. Now, 1770, it's taking its second or third seat to Philadelphia and New York. Still a thriving city, but not nearly as thriving as it had been 30, 40 years before this. They have been, however, they've been the most vocal, the most resistant against the British measures like the stamp tax and other measures, Townshend Acts, other measures restricting trade. And they've been punished severely. And not only were there special taxes on Boston that actually made Boston the most taxed jurisdiction in all of the British Empire, but also 4,000 troops descended on Boston. And so we have a city of 16,000 people, 16,000 residents with 4,000 soldiers. Imagine that. Just imagine that. And they're trying, the leaders are trying to maintain peace. The average citizens are furious. There's epidemics brought by the soldiers. There are a number of conflicts, but on the other hand, there's widespread desertion by the British troops. That's sort of an interesting aspect. And then there are also quite a few, surprising number of marriages between colonial women and soldiers during the occupation. And so, all of those sort of human aspects of, there's a lot of conflict, a lot of difficult self-discovery going on. And of course, all that overlays with, Duncan trying to solve murders. I mean, he is thrust into, again, as the book opens up, he's thrust into solving a really gruesome murder of a British officer. Desperately wants to not be able to blame the Patriots because he knows that'll set the army off. But it's going to be very difficult. And then, the murders pile up, and he before too long, realizes that whatever the outcome, either he's going to really upset the army into possibly violent action, or he's going to really upset the Patriots into violent action. And so he's got to find a way to reconcile all that while also protecting his fiancee, Sarah, who he discovers has brought in 8 runaway slaves from Barbados on top of everything else. And so, I have the themes of slavery and of course the Sons of Liberty and the secret agents, which is based on actual facts, secret agents working against the Patriots. And then, as you mentioned, there's these social currents of scientific discovery, and it's an explosion of what we would call scientific discovery. There is an explosion in the recent decades, in the mid 18th century, of literacy. I mean, the fact that people often don't understand is that Americans by then were more literate than people that lived in England. They read a lot more books. They had better schools than the people in England. Overall, the standard of living in America was considered the best in the Western Hemisphere. And so they sort of have been finding a good life based on a lot of the American resources and a lot of hard work, et cetera. But there's all these themes coming together, which is a lot of fun for a novelist. It's a matter of juggling them in some coherent way.
Oh, it certainly was a daily drama, history, when you look back, you think that it was just a series of events. And, you kind of forget that every day was some kind of a challenge. And when you're writing history about a time like this, or an historical novelist, almost any historical novelist, you have to bring in real people as well as fictional people. So Duncan actually works for John Hancock, when most of us know for his famous signature. Ben Franklin is wandering about, all kinds of real people. So you have to be faithful to the real about the real people, don't you? While you're crafting your fictional people around them.
Proud of the post I just did for Writer's Digest, and folks who are interested in that point ought to take a look at that on the duty of the historical novelist, because yes, absolutely, and I do. I went into this whole process with a foundation of historical knowledge, but I've done a huge amount since then. And one of the advantages of writing books set on basically in the North American continent is I've been able to visit every single location that I talk about, unlike all locations in Tibet that I talked about, and read biographies. I never focus on an authentic character from history without doing a lot of biographical research. So I read multiple biographies of Franklin. There's many good ones out there. There's a couple good ones on Hancock. There's a really good book. Also, you mentioned Marblehead, John Glover and the Marbleheaders, who became very famous in the war, were beginning to sort of flex their muscles at this time. And that's a really, really interesting set of people. And there's a great book called The Indispensables by Pat Donald about them. And I spent a lot of time reading that and rereading that book. It was a really good source.
Well, I do think, one of the other things you have to do when you're a novelist is that while history can unfold slowly despite the daily drama, you have to keep the pace going. And so, sometimes you have to speed up the action, and you do end up this book with an amazing chase scene, which you must have had a really good time writing. It's a very dramatic denouement for this particular story. I really enjoyed reading that. So do you have any actual experience, out on the river travel?
Not too much. My editor, and I were talking about that. He actually helped out because he did have a lot of experience on the river, but it's all very, historically based in terms of at that point, the escaped slaves are being sought by slave catchers, and the secret agents are still trying to go after Duncan, and all of those are themes that are authentic. And then his white knights, as it were, are all Mohawks, and so I bring the tribes back in at the end. And that's it. Although this book doesn't go too much into the tribes, like I said, most of the other ones do, and there's a lot of sympathy for the woodland tribes, and I believe that their role at this era is pretty underestimated. I think they did have a meaningful influence on society.
And they had to make some tough choices too. I mean, they were looking at extermination. And, there were a lot of sneaky things. I mean, I think it's true. Well, you probably know this better than I do, but I certainly have read that there was a certain amount of germ warfare, even though people didn't really know a whole lot about biological warfare. They did know about smallpox. And sometimes, as I understand it, that small blankets, for example, that have been, given to smallpox. This may be apocryphal, so you can set me straight if I'm wrong. But I have read that, sometimes blankets and so forth that had been given to smallpox patients were then given to some of the native tribes, and they were basically defenseless against all the European diseases. In the same way, Eliot, I've been to Peru 3 different times, and really fascinated with the Incan culture and other tribes in South America, and they were just decimated by the Spanish. I mean, it wasn't really that military prowess that allowed Pizarro and whatever to conquer them. It was much more the effect of, and I think it was measles as much as anything.
And I mean, this goes beyond the scope of my books, but I read a lot about a lot of this history, and there's a lot of historians that try to estimate and try to make educated guesses about what happened in the with the tribes with the onslaught of Europeans, and most there seems to be a fair amount of agreement now that probably 90% of the natives of the Americas, and it's actually more in Latin America, South America, and Mexico than in North America. There were a much bigger population in those areas. 90% of them died before main settlement by Europeans started on the East Coast because of disease.
Right.
The Spanish already done their thing in Mexico and Latin America, and people don't focus on this, but European fishermen were coming to the New England coast, especially in the 1500s, and they're the ones that brought the diseases that wiped out most of the tribes. I mean, there are the natives that helped the Pilgrims, there's tragic stories about them because a number of them, a couple of them had gone to, Squanto, the famous Squanto, had gone to Europe and come back, and his people were completely gone. They had all died of disease. And so these coastal tribes have been hit really hard by disease. And then going back to my series, all of my native characters are certainly, they're tragic, but they all have their sort of own personal integrity, and that's what they're left with. That they still have to be sort of true to their own spirituality. They have their own integrity, and they most of them haven't given up on that. They stay honorable, and sort of live for the spirit of their lost tribe. And there's a lot of there's in implicit tragedy and all of that, but there's also a certain nobility that I play to in the books that I bring out.
Do. And you did that. That was a theme very much true in your Tibetan series about the native nobility of Tibet and the monks and so forth. So
those two series, and my answer is that I've never considered that there is that much difference between the two series, because they're about people that have been battered by the world, battered by their governments and society, whether it's Highland Scots or the Iroquois, the other tribes, or the Tibetans or the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are in some of the books. These are people who have been totally battered, and they have massive reasons to be cynical and desolate and despairing, but they stick to it, and they keep their nobility, and in a way, that is a fundamental theme of the Sean books. Because Sean knows he can't beat the government, but he has to find a way that keeps his self-respect and integrity, and the integrity for the Tibetans that he's helping. And so Duncan, the same way, he knows the British government has destroyed his people. After Culloden, the government went in, the army went in and just decimated. It was just like, in a way, it was worse than what happened to the Indians. At least by 1770, they had not suffered that kind of massive destruction that the army inflicted on Highlanders. And he has to stay true to the Highland spirit, the Highland tradition, and of course there are Highland survivors, and there's more of that Highland spirit and culture in America by then than there's left in Scotland.
Absolutely. Well, it's also in Canada. We're the Outlander bookstore, so I've been through this. With Diana, who writes movingly about what has happened. If you just sort of move past the time travel, the rest of it is very, very solid history. And many of them chose to go to the Carolinas. I used to live in that part of the country, and you could still see that, the reason that there were, folk songs, the reason there was, whiskey making, the reason there were quilting and all, many of the Appalachian, cultural themes and whatever that we think about in their skills were really brought to them from the Highland. But there were also many of them that settled in Canada. So, right. They were forced into they were forced into a new world, but they kept much of their old culture with them, which would not have survived. And, there was a religious war up to that too, because, the Jacobins, the Stuart kings were Catholic, and that was one of the major problems, was that the British had determined then to be resolutely Protestant, and the Stuarts were still Catholic. And that, if you want to look at the great man of history, I could go back and talk to you about how terrible it was that James I's oldest son, Henry, died, and we got Charles I, who was, possibly a decent man and whatever, but he was the wrong guy. And often this is true. Louis XVI was the wrong guy for the momentous events that happened in France. Nicholas II was the wrong guy, in Russia. And it's, history can often be made, by the right guy at the right moment. And the right guy, a lot of it, you point out, were people like Hancock and people like Franklin. And, you can't discount Samuel Adams, who was a radical. Boston was I mean, it takes people like that to keep stirring the pot, you know. Not just
he certainly figures in my book, and
yeah.
Sam Adams and John Hancock, and they all, Sam Adams was sort of this defiant guy throughout, but John Hancock, and to some extent John Adams, evolved a lot. Hancock started out, and I was very, very true to his actual story. Started out during this period trying to appease the government, trying to impress the aristocrats. He was the wealthiest man in Massachusetts, and he was well known for his ostentatious show of wealth, but he also was and close to the governor and tried to be, impress the army all the time. But he was also a leader of the Sons of Liberty. And, that was a big conflict. And Duncan actually kind of lays into him a couple times in the book over that conflict and how he has to has to figure out who he is. And eventually he became a very ardent patriot and played a very important role in the revolution.
Hancock is interesting to me because he had so much to lose. Samuel Adams didn't really, but Franklin and Hancock, some of it, Washington, these were people of real substance. These were people who had money. These were people who, were really risking not just their lives, but their, everything they'd acquired for their descendants, the whole bit. And I've always thought, I remember visiting Annapolis, and this is the scene where Washington, if I remember this right, I think he handed over his sword there, but also, Washington, we were so lucky in Washington because he could have just been king. But, he really understood transfer of power. And, the fact that he served his term and then he went home, Harry Truman said sort of the same thing. I remember reading because he was not necessarily much admired at the time that he was president or afterward, although looking back, he did some very courageous things. But I still remember reading this, somebody asked him, what did he do? First thing he did when he went home to Missouri, what did he do? And his answer was he carried the suitcases up to the attic. I mean, he'd done his thing. And now, you contrast that with Trump, it's almost impossible to conceive, that we have come so far that we can't even achieve a peaceful transfer of power. And you look at, you're a lawyer, I've read the law. It's unbelievable, the legal, the lawyers who espoused all these really completely bizarre and fictitious for what reason? And now they're recanting, many of them. And, I have to, what caught them? What was it that made them abandon all sense and legal training, and espouse this crazy theory that I find it almost impossible.
Well, the laws have sort of become a real quagmire in America. I'm actually studying the founding fathers and the Federalist Papers right now, and I take online courses, most evenings, and they make the point that the founding fathers worried that there would be a proliferation of laws and that would just complicate everything because it would allow everybody to make all kinds of arguments. And and you project that out 200 plus years, and you can see what's happened. But going back to the book, I mean, all this stuff, none of that's happened yet. Not even America, U.S. hasn't been formed yet, it's a real, as I say in the author's note at the end, the foundation of America is sort of a miracle wrapped in mystery, because there's no precedent for it. There was no institution that they could follow. They studied the course classics, a lot of other philosophers, but nobody had ever put this stuff into action that they were trying to implement. And there was any number of reasons why it would fail, but they got through it.
They did. I wish that people were forced to read the Federalist Papers, and particularly Federalist Paper number 10, which is the most important in my view of all the Federalist Papers, because in it, Madison wrote that the system that they built would not be able to survive a tyranny of minorities. Right. That it requires a majority. And once you get to a series of tyrannies, which is what we're seeing right now, a tyranny of minorities is almost impossible for the center to hold. So I think that the next couple of years are really going to be almost make or break, in terms of whether this great American experiment will actually survive. Are you planning to write this series? You said this is book number 7. What year did you start with Bone Rattler? What were we in?
It was, well, the early ones, I was alternating the Sean books and these books. It was probably what year historically and the historic timeline?
No, what year historically? Sorry, not in terms of your writing.
It was French and Indian War.
So 1760s, essentially.
I think it was 1759 that I started.
Okay. So you've moved ahead 11 years. Are you planning to write this through the actual revolution?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting events that went on every year leading up to the revolution, and so there's a number of things going on in 71, 72, then the Tea Party in 73, and all of this intrigue in London with Ben Franklin, and he's up to his eyeballs in intrigue, in both in my books but also in real life. There's so much material. There's so much material. I mean, I take each one of these books, I try to develop a particular theme. Like the last book, The King's Beast, was heavy on science because it featured sort of early paleontology with Ben Franklin asking for bones of mysterious beasts to be brought to him from Kentucky to London, and Duncan winds up doing that. But also there's the transit of Venus, which is a very, very interesting aspect that most people don't know about, where it was a massive scientific quest to measure the distance, use the transit of Venus on the sun to measure the distance to the sun. And, it gets to be a complicated astronomical calculation, but it's possible. And the king was trying to do that. He built a whole laboratory, a whole observatory just for that purpose. But the amateur astronomers in Philadelphia were the ones that were successful. And he was at first very furious about that, but finally had to acknowledge that they had it right, and beat all the European scientists, And so there's a lot of really fun stuff. And of course, all the aspects with Ben Franklin and electricity and his lightning rods. There's actually a number of stories that could be told around all of that. He became very controversial around his lightning rods, and had a lot of arguments actually with the king and others over the proper placement of lightning rods, which is kind of interesting. So there's any number of there's so much material, any number of aspects that can be developed authentically, and going back. So I love being really authentic, and I will. When I start a book, one of these books, I take the year and I study that year as much as possible. And I get one of my sources that I really love, and I have a sample here, is old newspapers from the period, which are still available. I mean, you have to look for them, but they're still out there. Actually, it's easier to find a newspaper from 1770 or 1780 than it is to find one from 1850, because these papers from the 18th century were printed on rag paper, meaning cotton fiber, and the ones starting in the mid 19th century were on newsprint that are very acidic, and they all got brittle and just sort of shatter, break when you touch them. And so, if they haven't been preserved properly, you can't really use a paper from 1850. But you can from 1750. And so I love reading those papers, both from London. There's more from England available in that period than America, but they're very, very informative in terms of catching the spirit of the times and sort of the pulse of daily life, and the issues that were the common talk on the streets of the colonial towns and London. So that all of that is really, really helpful. And there's again, so much material in every one of these years, that lend itself to fiction.
Well, you certainly won't run out of material. I don't know that you'll make it all the way to 1782, but you could probably make it to 1776. So, Eliot, what brought you to writing novels? I mean, what was your previous? Don't I remember you're a lawyer?
Yeah. So I was very lucky. I've been writing like ever since high school, a long, long time ago. But I
Right.
would write little essays and book reviews and student newspaper sort of things, and then I would, and then in law school, I started writing book reviews for newspapers, the Boston Globe, etc. And then when I became a lawyer, I not long after starting practice, probably just like a second or third year lawyer, I started writing, decided to write legal books, but they were not that, after the fourth one, I wasn't that excited about it. And so I had always aspired, it was like a long shot for me, a distant dream to write fiction. And by then I had taken a job that took me around the world. I traveled it heavily. I stopped counting after I'd logged a million air miles. And that was like by the late 1990s. And I spent a lot of time in China and Tibet, and it's seeing the persecution of Tibetans firsthand. And it really deeply bothered me, because I knew how valuable the Tibetan culture was, and I knew how wonderful the Chinese people were overall. And to see what the tyranny of Beijing was doing was, really eating away at me. And so I wanted to write a novel. I thought mystery would be my vehicle. And then I realized that, hey, I might be able to bring in Tibet and China, into a mystery, and that's what gave rise to the Skull Mantra series.
Well, being a lawyer certainly taught you research skills and discipline in writing. And if you're a lawyer, you're not allowed to have writer's block if you're if you're writing up a trial or whatever it was. So, were you doing commercial law? Is that why you were traveling so much?
International investment work.
Oh, okay, right. And so, you live now in a rural area, so presumably you've retired largely from practicing law and you're writing, and that's, so you're getting to do the thing that you love. But practicing law gave you the foundation for being able to do it, right?
Yeah, that's right. I still consult a bit for old clients on special problems, but mostly writing and enjoying retired life. Yeah,
well, it's hardly retired life when you're producing books as rapidly as you do. I have one more question while Patrick comes back to join us. Why did you call it Bone Rattler? I mean, that's the title of the first book, but why is it called Bone Rattler?
Mysterious title, but it's based on the Iroquois shaman, who was Sarah Ramsey's the female protagonist here. Her Iroquois father was a shaman, or like a holy man, and he was deeply feared, but also deeply loved by the Iroquois people and by Sarah. And one of the things that he did was, he had like necklaces of bones that he would shake when he was like invoking the spirits. And that in the first book, in the Bone Rattler book, that becomes kind of an important feature and his role, and his sort of lifeline and how it affects the plot. That all ties into what happens with Sarah and Duncan. So it's sort of that Native American angle that I really wanted to deeply emphasize. But then it also it plays to Duncan as a doctor and trying to deal with dead bones, as it were. And so he's a death speaker, but he's kind of a bone rattler himself in that sense. So it's worked pretty well as a title.
It has worked. It's worked extremely well, but I thought people new to it might want to know that. The good news is this is book 7. You can read the first 6, or you can read this as a standalone and go buy it. And the great thing about historical fiction is you don't have to age people in real time, because real time has already passed. But at the same time, if you're doing what you're doing, which is marching your way forward, then each of the books is taking us one step closer to 1776, right?
And then one of the books can be picked up on its own. You don't have to read them in sequence or anything.
Yeah. Now, I would also like to give a shout out to Eliot, who has very kindly over time donated some books to us to give away to people, so we can interest you in reading the series. And I think we have a new supply at the store, and I tend to give them away at other author events, so that it kind of spreads the word. But we might this time, we might pick one, and for all the people who buy the new book, Freedom's Ghost, we might do a little raffle inside our store. So, it's not corrupt, but you don't get to participate. And we can award one person a complimentary book. So, Patrick, come and join us. If you have questions or any questions from the audience, this is the moment.
Well, yes, and I also have to give a shout out to Julia Drake,
Mhm.
Eliot's and our other friend Boston Terran's ace publicist, who's on the comments feed. She's really great.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Question, let's see, from Linda. Did you investigate Hancock's participation in the Boston Tea Party? Supposedly he was smuggling tea and lost customers when East India lowered their prices. Legal tea was cheaper than smuggled tea. Fascinating.
Yeah. So I haven't. So this is only 1770, and the Tea Party is 1773. But John Hancock, almost every merchant at the time, especially New York and Boston, was smuggling in some fashion. And so there every shipload that came in with foreign cargo, they would declare only half of the goods, or there would be, it was like a standard practice. And so yes, Hancock did engage in smuggling, and Hancock did have an economic interest in all these things that were going on with the government, taxation, etc. That's all part. It's a good question, because it highlights how there were all these conflicts, and he had to decide. I mean, eventually he had to choose the cause of liberty over his own pocketbook. But in these early years, he was still very much concerned with his pocketbook.
And I had a question about, weeding through when you're dealing with, this history. There's so much mythology that's built up over these events, and you think about people that were, brought up on the Leatherstocking books of Fenimore Cooper. And are there any current sort of historians that you really like who are publishing new kind of reassessments of the period? I know Nathaniel Philbrick has done some popular ones.
Yeah, I mean, he's done some good ones, and I tend to focus on the books that dissect specific people or events or locations, like Patrick O'Donnell's indispensable. So O'Donnell is really good at doing that. He's done other books like The Immortals, based on the Maryland Revolutionary War fighters. The story, the history books, tell history sort of in a PowerPoint style these days, and it's macro, and history happened at a micro level. And so I like those historians that go after the micro level, and that's kind of and my books do that to some extent. I do believe, as I said, that historical fiction is a really, really good way to learn about the history. Once you find a writer who is truly authentic, and I go to great pains to be sure I'm authentic. You have to be true to the facts. You can't let the facts impinge on the fiction, but you also can't let the fiction impinge too far on the facts.
And you have to have characters that are interesting enough, to carry a story. You can't just have stereotypes or cartoonish figures that are carrying your story. And you have to have pace. And I've always admired the pace of Eliot's books. I mean, it sounds like, and it is a lot of history, but at the same time, the action is just moving along. They're really thrillers in most respects. I'm telling you, the chase scene at the end of Freedom's Cup is remarkable. I loved it. It was a really great finish. You've sort of got your heart in your mouth. You think it just can't work, and then there it is. It was well done.
Well, thanks for that.
What about the challenge of writing dialogue in historical period? How do you kind of get that as accurate as you possibly can?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and because you want to make it accurate, but also if you totally followed the forms of speech used in certain periods, it would be almost incomprehensible, right? And so there's a compromise there, and I compromise a bit, but I do my best to be as authentic as possible. And there's some of my sources of newspapers. Okay, those are really good because they show how people were saying things, and there were constructions that were used in speech that we don't use today. And so, I use that to some extent. You don't want to overwhelm the reader with something that's really alien, but that does show up. There are some interesting glossaries, from the 18th century. There's a great book that I really enjoy and use it as a resource. It's called Sea of Words. And it's really like a dictionary. I recommend it. It's like a dictionary for people that read the Patrick O'Brian novels, but also is, a really, really good source on these sort of things. So it's a dictionary, but it also has in the beginning several chapters just about maritime life and early medicine and economy and things like that, and a lot of that, and also speech. So it's that there are some sources like that. There's a number of sources of that nature around the Highland Scots as well. In fact, I think
Probably letters too, right? I would imagine.
yeah, and you have the letters. I mean, there are a lot of the more prominent people from that era. You have a lot of their letters. John Adams, especially, he had a lot of letters, very prolific.
And you have to be careful because words can change their meaning.
Yeah.
So you also have to be careful that I mean, the words queer and gay, for example, meant entirely different things when I was a child than they currently mean. Since we've been talking about Patrick O'Brian, Eliot, I'm going to send you a book because there's an author that I absolutely love called Galernter, J.H. Galernter. And I came to him with his second book called Captain Gray's Gambit. But he has now written 3 books, and they're very much, it's Napoleonic or slightly before Napoleonic, and they're very much like Patrick O'Brian. He's an agent of the British Crown, and there's lots of great sea stuff in it. But I think you would really like it, Patrick. We probably have the first one's called Hold Fast. Can you make a note to just charge it to me and send Eliot a copy of Hold Fast?
Yeah.
I think Captain Gray's Gambit, I like it slightly better, but I think you would absolutely love these books. You have to read something that's not research every once in a while.
I will, right. But Patrick O'Brien's novels are they're not just research. I mean, I have all of them on audio, and so if I'm on car trip, I've probably listened to Patrick O'Brien's each one of his novels probably 3 or 4 times through the years.
And you can see if you agree with me how I think Galernter is just doing a marvelous job. And he's published by Norton, which is a smaller independent publisher. And I'm doing my best to keep the series going because I am so enamored of it. But anyway, and there's those same questions about, language choices and vocabulary choices and, my husband is in a book club, and I saw yesterday that he wrote to say he would not be attending Sunday night, and I couldn't think of why. They're reading the Canterbury Tales. So I said to him, Rob, why aren't you going? And he said, I thought I would try to read them as close to the original as I could. And he said, I bought that, whatever it is, and there's a footnote for every sentence. And he said, I just can't even get through The Wife of Bath. And I thought, it's nearly impossible to read, Chaucerian English without a complete translation today. I mean, you just can't do it. And I thought, bless his heart. So as a reader, you sometimes have to, acknowledge that maybe you need to read a more up to date. That's why I guess, Patrick, think about the Iliad, which is having a whole renaissance because there's the new translation of it. And who was the Irish? Was it Beowulf? Or I'm trying to remember. What was somebody translated one of the old poems?
Seamus Heaney did a translation.
That's it. Right. And, those books almost became bestsellers because they had taken these, older stories in language that most people can't read anymore and translated them to a modern idiom that tries to keep the flavor and the rhythm and all, but at least allows people to read them without a footnote in every sentence. So anyway, I really enjoyed that when he revealed that he'd bought it in the almost original English and just couldn't even get through The Wife of Bath. Bless his heart. Anyway, is there anything else, Patrick, or do you need to go? Patrick is about to entertain an author who I think the original title for his first book. It's one of my all-time favorite mystery titles, and it's called Holmes, Holemes, Holmes on the Range. So it's basically a Western Sherlock Holmes, and I think you have to go a long way to beat Holmes on the Range as a series title. It's just so great.
Yeah, that's great. And also, it's interesting because in this new book, early paleontology is one of the topics. You know, the
Really?
1890s Wyoming, and these scientists are out doing a dig, and of course they find some human remains along with the dinosaur bones. You know, so it should be fun.
It should be
Yeah.
fun. Well, Eliot, thank you for your time. Julia, thank you very much for everything you do to facilitate our working with Eliot. And I will chase down Freedom's Choice tomorrow, Eliot, to find out where it is. It's probably going to land on your doorstep tomorrow morning. So those of you who are watching this, you need to be patient for probably about 10 days until our copies arrive from Eliot's home to the Poison Pen. And those of you who belong to our historical fiction club will be getting a copy automatically. So happy holidays to everybody. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, Eliot. Keep writing.
Thanks.